Awesome. Hello, everyone. Today is Tuesday, October 10th, 2023. This is a meeting of the SIG Network Policy API subgroup to SIG Network. It is a CNCF sponsored meeting, so please be nice to each other and follow the code of conduct. So today we are mostly just going through NPEPs. We have a pretty full agenda, so I will go ahead and bring that up. Feel free to hop in if there's anything we need to do before we start running through the agenda. Okay, let me get the agenda into its own tab so that you all don't have to see my embarrassingly large number of tabs. Okay. Cool. Okay, so first on the agenda was Nadia in regards to your tenancy NPEP, I assume, right?
Oh, it's
Or is
actually
it just a
more,
generic question?
yeah, it's more about my ingress and PEP, which is another one following Surya's egress and PEP. Can you hear me?
Right. Yep,
Yeah.
we gotcha.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, and I also think that Dan probably should have some thoughts on that, but also if anyone else has something to say, it would be nice to discuss. So, generally speaking, there is, a way that Kubelet does health checks on the node. So which for network policies, at least, it makes it required to allow connections from pod's own node always to make it work. And there is I know, an ongoing discussion on how that can be actually changed to be more configurable, but as far as I know, it's far from being like decided and implemented. So I think we'll need to leave with the existing way of how Kubelet does this for some time. So I wanted to raise this question in regards to ongoing ingress and PEP effort. So let's say we go a similar way to the egress and PEP, and then we add, for example, node selectors and CIDR-based rules for ingress.
Mm-hmm.
That actually leads us to this problem of how to make this kubelet work. And I know we didn't want to have anything implicit, so it would be nice to maybe at least have explicit rules that we can recommend to admins to create for that case. And also they can be then removed as soon as some new ways for health checks are implemented. But there is a kind of problem that it would require some special kind of selector, because you don't want to allow traffic from all nodes probably,
Mm-hmm.
but also from only from the pod's own node, which is a kind of dynamic selector similar to same labels, if that makes sense.
Well, it's a little bit simpler, right? Isn't the problem a little bit simpler because it's always going to be allow traffic from the main node IP, like underlying the policy. The rule that's actually in the data plane is just going to say allow traffic from kubelet, which has the same IP of the main NIC of the node, right? Or local host.
Well, do you mean that we will not have that in ANP itself?
No, I mean, I think today in network policy, how does it work? You were saying that today in network policy, users have to write an explicit rule allowing traffic from that IP, or is that ignored in
I
many
think that's
CNIs?
what, I think that's what the network plugin does itself.
Okay.
From what I, from
So the
the
network plugin
documentation.
basically says
Yeah.
always allow kubelet, always allow traffic. I believe like in OvenK, we used to always allow traffic from the node to a pod. So this would essentially be allowed.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's it's an internal implementation, and it only allows traffic from the same node the pod is
Mhm.
scheduled on.
Right.
And I think when we discussed that at some point, we wanted to get rid of that because it's implicit, right? When you want to know which traffic is allowed from node to pods, for example. So Yeah, and I see Surya has a question. I'll actually find that discussion and link it here about kubelet health checks. Yeah, but what I'm trying to figure out is if we want to do something similar to what network policy does and just not say anything about that and not have any explicit rules, or if we do want to just make these rules explicit for kubelet health checks, then we may need some tricky API for that.
Surya, go ahead.
Yeah, the way we do it for network policies is I was reading this last week, and on the documentation, I'm finding it hard to find it exactly where in the docs, but in the documentation, it's explicitly mentioned that when a pod is isolated for ingress type traffic, the only allowed connections to the pod are from the same node. So it's explicitly called out in the documentation, but it's implicit, it's because network policy implicitly denies traffic. So we documented it saying every implementation should explicitly allow this, otherwise kubelet health checks won't work, right? So I guess I'm +1 to Nadia's point in the sense we should no longer make these things implicit. So when we are, at least for ANP and BANP, and in future for network policy v2 or DNP, we should really say that as cluster admins, you need to explicitly allow, right? So if you're going to deny using node selectors, you're going to deny everything. Like, we're not going to give you this, implementation should just have a rule underlying which allows these health checks, right? So you shouldn't do that anymore for security reasons, I think.
Right. So for the egress use case with node selectors, like, are there a lot of use cases that don't involve, like allowing egress from a pod on node A to node B? Like, aren't most of the use cases regarding like the node that the pod's living on anyway today?
I think some of the use cases we have is for API servers, right? Which are different nodes. Like,
Right.
so block your workloads from accessing API servers is cross-node connection. So for egress and PEP that I have currently, and I think we are bypassing Hunter's point now because I have it on my section as the third point, which kind of combines with what Nadia was trying to say. We don't have any explicit use cases that requires special selection, right? So all the user stories that I had on the NPEP, which we merged, can be accomplished by just having node selector. It's just labels of nodes, right? But for ingress, it's getting tricky here. And then even if we don't want to go to the complicated level of wanting tenancy explicitly, at least to start off, we might need something that is same or is not same, similar to what we had earlier for namespaces. But then we realized we don't need it for namespaces anymore because it has this metadata tag as a label, which you can use using label selectors, right? So
right, that was a little bit easier, and a node doesn't have a similar mechanism.
Right, that's what puts us in. Exactly. Otherwise, we could have easily done this using selectors again. So at least even I wouldn't make it as complicated as like this whole new tenancy thing that we're doing for pods, right? That I don't think we need to go that far, but we still need to be able to express myself and not myself, as in myself being the same node that I live on. For ingress. Right. And for egress, we don't need it, right? So that's also coming to my point, which is, are we at a stage where we want to digress the way we define egress peers and ingress peers on our API? Or should we just keep them consistent and let users
I don't have a problem with digressing ingress and egress peers as a set, but those are a number of different things. Like, there's a number of different types of peers today. I think a node peer could be different for ingress and egress, right?
Yeah.
So in my opinion, Nadia, it makes sense to have some sort of specific way to allow ingress from node, right? Which will solve this issue from the node I live on. I don't know how that's going to look in the API, but it seems like it's needed.
Yeah, it sounds like we need a concept of my node from the pod's point of view, so to say. And it may be just some special keyword, and you may define like nodes, select nodes by node selector or with this
Right.
special alias keyword, so to say.
I think if you run into a lot of like problems thinking about it, like obviously same labels, not same labels, created weird, unique situations where, you know, the subject was kind of changing. I think if you can flesh all those out without it getting too complicated, it makes sense to have some special node selector. If not, you could keep it really tight and explicit. You could say, like, you could literally just have a Boolean that says allow kubelet liveliness checks true or something, or allow, you know, traffic from node true, without much like expressibility. It just depends on how complex it ends up being.
Yeah, it shouldn't be any close to tenancy because there is no need to actually split anything into tenants. So I just said same labels as just another example of a dynamic selector, so to say. So it's actually not related to tenancy in any way. So I don't think it's going to be complicated. But it's a new kind of peer, so to say.
Yeah, cool. I'm all right with it.
Yeah,
I think it's needed.
And that also ties.
Go ahead, sure.
Yeah, go ahead. I was just about to say that, you know, this new thing, it also raises the question, right? If it's something cool enough to have, why not allow egress also for it, right? Like, it's on the user if they want to use it or not. But if you want to express, give me egress to myself, it's totally fine, right? It's kind of like this pass action on egress, which we don't explicitly have a use case for, but you can still have it. Like if we want to do it for ingress, we could think about it, though we don't have use cases for egress at the moment.
Works for me.
Yeah, I think while it's well defined, the behavior for both ingress and egress, it's fine, right?
Yeah, exactly. And go ahead, Jan.
Yeah, I agree with most of the point here. But I was just wondering, because since the current policy, you know, thanks for pointing it out, Sherry. I didn't really dive really deep into it, but it appears that, you know, when a pod is isolated, right now the semantics is defined being, you know, the self node to pod traffic is always sort of like allowed. I'm just wondering if there's actually a particular reason to that. Maybe that, you know, in a SIG network, when they design a network policy, they have decided that this kind of traffic makes sense to actually be always allowed. And, you know, when people configure something and then they accidentally sort of like block node to pod traffic, like self node to self pod traffic, it's sort of like 100% a mistake rather than a valid use case in some particular scenario. So I'm just wondering, like, I know we wanted to be explicit about this, but let's say we set a boolean flag, right? Now, if we do that, it also looks bad if there's no scenario at all we can set this boolean flag to false, right? Like say allow node to self, and like we never set it to false. So the sole purpose of existence of this field is to just, you know, tell people, hey, I wanted to explicitly call out that this is allowed, but it doesn't really configure it, right? So that's what I'm, you know, a little bit worried about.
So from what I know, it's only allowed because of health checks, but we can try to confirm that. And I also think that Dan may have more knowledge about that. So maybe we can ask him later. And then another thing to that is it may be useful to also now, I think all traffic from the same node should be allowed, if I remember that right from the docs. But actually to allow only health checks from kubelet, you can also add a port to that, which is, I guess, predefined. So that it's for now, even if you cannot really. Sorry?
Okay. Is it the port you're sorry, am I cutting off? I'm still asked. Is what you're referring to?
You're breaking up for me.
Like
is
the
it just me?
Health check port that's
Yeah, you're a little choppy. Yang.
Yeah, my bad. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I think so.
Yep.
Okay, so let me keep it straight. Is the port you're referring to the house check port that's defined in the POS spec? Because from the node side, we can't really know which port, the house check is coming from, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think there is like the default or configured port for health checks, and cluster admin probably should know it, and then I guess they can specify this rule for that port specifically. But again, it's mostly about being explicit, even if we cannot really remove that rule and still have the working cluster. It can be the case in the future, and also mostly about being explicit at this point.
I see. Yeah. So right, I think in short, I'm obviously in favor of the idea of being explicit. I just don't want, an API that's just there to signal something but not actually configurable, if that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Plus one.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Plus one.
also hopefully when I find this discussion, we'll see. I'm not sure if it's gonna be acted on, but at least there are some plans and discussions about making this more configurable. So that should not that rule should be configurable in the future, hopefully.
Yeah, so I think maybe as an action item to follow up, we could add this as one of the, I don't know if you already have it, Nadia, in your ingress NPET. You can add a user story for this if you already haven't. And then we can also maybe start a thread with Dan Winship on our network policy API channel, maybe, to see how to take this forward.
Exactly, yeah. I'll do that.
Cool. Awesome. I think it's a really good conversation. Thanks, Nadia. It'll be exciting to see if we can do this better than Network Policy did. I wonder how many more times we're going to run into this too. These cases where, like before with all our design, we've kind of looked at it point blank saying like, oh yeah, with this tool, ANPs can kind of, I mean, you could break a cluster, right? Like you could, by default out of the box, make all your kube system pods not able to talk to anything and like really corrupt it. And I think the thing that could happen with network policy too. And the thing we've done so far is taken the hard line of like be explicit, say like this is a dangerous admin tool, you can break stuff, never default unexpectedly allow things. So as long as we stay in that way, I think we'll be all right. But if we like wrote in our spec all of a sudden now like, oh, just allow it, that could be confusing for users. So I think we're doing the right thing.
Yeah, and I think one of the advantages of ANP is that unless you're explicitly denying it, you're really not denying anything, right? We don't have an implicit deny. So usually most of the use cases are deny at 6443 or 443 or something, right? Which is the API server, like the most common use cases. So accidentally denying entire access to your node would be hopefully rare, but yeah.
Yep. Cool. Okie doke. Moving on. I don't think Hunter is here, but I saw last night Hunter's made a bunch of issues for repurposing Cyclonus, which is really awesome. He's kind of picked up the work on this and made some new stuff. I think the first item of importance is being able to use Cyclonus as kind of some tooling. So in the original CEP, like we said, we have to have tooling for ANP, because think about when multiple AMPs start getting put on a cluster, you're going to have rules of different priorities. It'd be great to have a simple, kubectl described like command in order to understand the stance of the cluster, what the heck is going on. So I think that's priority number one. And there's some issues here. for that, and then priority number 2 would be seeing how we can integrate with the conformance, how we can help make conformance better, how we can help make it easier using some of the Cyclonus code that probably won't be called Cyclonus here in a little bit. So I think for now, Surya likes it being called NetPol Assistant. I like that too. I think for now we're just at the issue stage, but if anyone's listening and this sounds really interesting for you, I think this will be a really fun project. And I'm sure Hunter could use some help, but he's kind of architecting things for now, and I'll be trying to help where I can. Looks like he is aiming to tackle 152 first. Let's just look at that real quick, which seems kind of like a core development item for Cyclonus involving data structures. So yeah, I think for me, I'm excited to see movement on this. I'm gonna be reviewing some of Hunter's PRs, and with the goal of making Hunter the kind of approver for Cyclonus related things here moving forward, because he's kind of stepped up and really owned it, and that's awesome. That's what we want. So if anyone wants to get involved as well, just reach out to me or Hunter, and we'll keep pushing it forward. So, and make any votes on the name of the new tool. I'm all right with NetPol Assistant. I guess, let me think. Yeah, I guess there's going to be a lot of different network policies. So even, I don't know if we're ever going to come up with a resource that doesn't have policy in the name. Cool. Awesome. Well, huge shout out to Hunter again. So if he reaches out to anyone, please help him out. He's kind of been soldiering on this completely alone so far, and really good work. So if you're watching Hunter, keep going on. Any questions about that? Cool. Okay, let's keep going on. Surya, your egress support NPEP, it has been reopened. Awesome. So the first draft merged with user stories, and now Surya is investigating some implementation stuff. So you have some questions for the group here?
Yeah, if you want to apply the rich difference thingy, that might render it better in the MD format. So just close on the right side, close to the page button thingy that you see. Yeah, that one.
Sorry, I'm clueless. This one?
You were there. Yep. Yeah, much
what?
better.
I didn't even know about this. That's awesome. Okay.
Yeah, so in the NPEP for the user stories for egress, we talked about adding support to being able to talk towards cluster nodes, towards API servers, right? API servers can be anything, host network pods, nodes, external VMs, bootstrap VMs, whatever it is in the cluster, and then also proper egress for CIDRs. So this is what this stage of the NPEP is doing. So API design aspects of it. I'm currently only tackling egress, right? So the first question I had is really the deviation from ingress. My idea was to add that kube builder validation that I have below that prevents you from accessing, let's say, nodes, right? I mean, we can work on what that nodes will look like, right? Whether it's a selector, whether it's more than a selector, another type, like Nadia was saying, to express is same, not same. So that's open for discussion. But let's just call it nodes as the new thing, as a way to define a peer. In which case, my idea was to have a validation rule that prevents you from accessing this nodes thing from your ingress peers till the ingress NPEP is merged, right? And when we merge it, we can just remove this validation, and then the same thing will be accessible from ingress as well. And same thing I was thinking for external peers, which is the CIDR selector thing. However, API folks are telling me that it is better to keep two different CRDs. So one for ingress and one for egress. And I don't know how this will work, especially because Yang and I have already finished our implementations. Though we are, at least in OpenShift, it's a tech preview. So I'm okay to break things, right? So when I say break, I mean the way this is rendered on the client and lister side of things is it deep copies the pointer fields, right? So suddenly if I change the type of the field to a new thing for ingress and egress, that's internally going to do some different things, right? Like it's not, while it might be seamless to a user, it's still changing the type of the field is still an API change, right? Like, can I just, today we call it admin network policy peer. If I change this to be admin network policy ingress peer and admin network policy egress peer, that is going to cause some amount of huge disruption compared to how RV1 Alpha 1 is, isn't
Right.
it? Or
Yes, but we're still in alpha, right? Like there is no, we aren't really providing any guarantees. And based on our earlier discussion today, you know, I don't think we're going to go to two different resources, first of all, unless like there's some crazy change in our thinking. But maybe it does make sense internally to represent different types for ingress and egress peers. I wouldn't be as worried about breaking, you know, API breakage right now. I would just ask ourselves, like, what does the future look like, right? If there's going to be more things besides this, then let's go ahead and make separate types. If there's not, then maybe some smart cube builder validations will work. Rahul, go ahead.
I mean, for sure, something like FQDN is egress only, and probably always will be. And it's much nicer to look at a list of selectors and just know that I can use all of them rather than to read what is, you know, quite frankly, a rather confusing validation rule and try to understand what it's telling me I can and can't do.
I agree. It's a good point. So at the very least, we have one more feature that's going to be egress only. So is your worry with changing the type here? I don't quite understand your worry, like your main concern. I feel like it's a completely reasonable thing to do internally as a V1 Alpha 1 API. For you as a downstream consumer, right? You're worried that what the implementation is going to have a lot of flux.
I think the part that I probably need to read more upon is when we build this and ship it, right? The way we rebuild all the client set generators and listers and all the controller gen stuff, the way we are deep copying the fields in the API for, let's say, now it used to be type admin network policy peer. So let's say I had an ANP CRD with this type. And if I upgrade to a version where I'm changing this to an egress peer or an ingress peer, what happens to the existing CRDs?
Well, you would have to write a conversion webhook, right?
Not necessarily. If those aren't actually conflicting sort of like types, or if you don't like add a new field that's not in the previous version or something, I think you know, when you do controller gen, it actually auto generates everything so that you know it's converted automatically. You don't have to explicitly write a conversion webhook. You only write a conversion webhook if there are things that you need to explicitly, you know, convert. For example, if in one of the field it was originally one value, now in the second version you convert it to a list. It means that it can't be converted back and forth, right? Because if this is one value, you can easily put it in the list. This is the part where, you know, controller gen and everything will automatically pop up a conversion function for you. You don't really have to do anything. You just do like make controller gen and everything works. But the reverse is not, right? Because you needed to tell the conversion webhook, you know, what to do if there's a list. And now if you convert to a previous type, you need to boil down to a single value. How does that work? This is something that you need to write explicitly. So this is like the only time you have to manually write a conversion webhook. So at this point, if you know we originally have a peer, now you break it to the ingress and egress, but the field are sort of like exactly the same. The conversion webhook will be automatically taken care of if you just run controller gen. That I'm pretty sure.
Got it. Okay.
Plus if you're plus if you're worried about breaking client-side things, obviously when people just apply a YAML, it won't change anything, right? Because the field doesn't really change. The only breaking change I can think of is when programs are actually doing programmatic access to the AMP APIs, where they use the client Go libraries to maybe build the AMP. That may have some changes they needed to apply, but at this stage, I don't feel like a lot of the programs will be doing that. Apart from our CNIs, but we are the one changing it, so right. So
yeah,
I think we should be fine there as well.
Awesome. Yeah. So as far as Antrea is concerned, Yan, you're okay if I go with this split now, right? Because it's now or never kind of thing. Like we might as well do it early to avoid running into future issues.
I'm okay. Yeah. Yes, I'm okay. I think yes, like you mentioned, there's definitely going to be some changes made, but that shouldn't be too bad.
Yeah.
And there's gotta be in the implementation itself, obviously there's going to be a lot of redundancies because there were some like a lot of shared code for ingress and egress. Now you have to separate them just because they're on different types, right? But but it should be okay. On the user side, I do agree that to be more future proof, maybe having separate types would benefit. So
+1.
Awesome. Cool. I've tried to write down what all of you said, but I think the consensus is towards having separate types. So I will change my implementation API to reflect that, and we can throw away the kube validation rules. And yeah, so that was the first thing. The second thing was, since we are defining pods, right? And sorry, since we're defining nodes and external destinations, I've not come yet to the external destinations part, but since we are defining all these, we are thinking about host network pods and etc., though there is no use case for explicit host network pods for egress as of now, can we at least take the action of correcting our current pods SPRs, right? So we define, so one of the types of admin network policy peer is namespaces and pods. At least for the pods, can we call out the fact that the API currently today means only CNI pods when we say pods? Because this is undefined right now, right? So can we, are folks okay in me explicitly changing it in the API? Like in the comment of the API saying pods mean CNI pods.
Yes, I think that's sort of like a real one, right? Like I remember there's a discussion and we mentioned why explicitly why we haven't been selecting host network pods as a peer as of now. So I think that's the right thing to do.
And
cool.
For namespaces, please.
Yeah, I wanted to raise the namespaces topic because I know, Nadia, you have also a lot mentioned this before. Namespaces, I think, is a bit tricky because it can be anything. Today pod is the smallest unit, and so pod is the only thing we consider within a namespace. But tomorrow, if we end up selecting services or whatever, this might change. So today we just say a collection of namespaces, right? So I'm gonna leave that as is, right? Because indirectly, or do you think I should call it out there also? I don't know, I'm confused.
Yeah, I think we will need an API change anyway, right? To consider like services or whatever other types. So why not then update this description to if now we don't really think about anything else, or are there any disadvantages?
This is a tricky one. We've gone back and it's a tricky one we've gone back and forth on in the whole time. A lot of times, right? Yeah, I think like in the past we've always.
Oh, sorry.
No, you're good. You go ahead.
I was about to say, technically speaking, Nadia, if you want to support services, right, you would have another peer here called services, and then you would call it namespace service peer. But namespaces would then include everything in the namespace, right, which is pods and endpoints. So it's tricky that you don't really have to redefine namespaces in that case as an API perspective, but yeah, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, if there are any existing objects that are being selected as a part of this namespace selector, which are not pods, CNI pods, then we shouldn't do that. But if there are no such examples, then I don't think it's breaking anything.
Yeah, maybe since I'm anyways just going to add comments, right? So for now, since we, like you're saying, we don't support anything more than a pod unit, even for namespaces, we can be explicit today, right? So if in future we do support non-pods, can we really change the definition of namespace then? I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think we can. I think as long as the comment stays explicit, right? Like you said, the unit of selection, right, has always been pods. If we add a CIDR, the unit of selection now probably isn't really a pod, it's an endpoint, right? With an endpoint including CIDRs and pods. Or we can keep them separate in the docs, doesn't matter. But I think like when you go to add a CIDR selector or a service selector, you can go back and change, the underlying meaning of namespaces, because now it is a bit different. I think that's totally all right.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think I'm okay with that. If there is no objections, I will open a PR to fix these two things so that we're explicit.
Cool.
Yeah, and then the final thing, which was the external networks CIDR part, right? So if you go back to the pull request, there is two ways that we could define the CIDR. If you scroll down, yeah, we could put the CIDRs explicitly as a peer, right? So as an egress peer, just the list of CIDRs. Or what I did here, which I've shown, is something that Calico does, but they do it for different reasons, which is to explicitly have this defined as an external network set, which you see below. So if you scroll down into a little bit more, right? So here you can see you want a storage network, you have a DNS network, and then you have a global network, etc., etc. So you have a list of fixed things, and then you can use label selectors to refer to these things as an external destination. So this is one way of doing it. The other way of doing it is the same like what network policy does, which is put a list of IP blocks directly onto your object. The advantage that this gives you with the new object is if you want to reference the same thing from your BA and P for the pass action and for your developer network policies moving forward, you can just use labels and it stays consistent, versus you have to make sure that it's consistent across if you're explicitly putting the CIDR on the API. But having said that, Nadia also pointed out a good point when I was discussing this, that it might reduce visibility. So let's say that you only have a very few list of CIDRs, you might find it more advantageous to just put the list straight on the ANP API and not have this complicated extra CRD that we have to watch. So I guess at this point, I'm okay going both ways. I'm just looking for feedback on how folks prefer the definition of how the CIDR should look like. And in case we want to do FQDN as an egress network destination definition, right? Like putting that as a second type in the spec here, if that works, or if we want to, like, I guess, do we want to keep overloading the peer thing now that we have decided to digress an egress peer and an ingress peer anyways, or do we want a new object?
So I know Gateway API does this a lot, right? Shane, maybe you could chime in. Is there any ways y'all reduce complexity when you have, say, a gateway object referring to other objects in your API, or is it just kind of as is, right? Like it's going to be a little more complex for a user.
I think it's generally fair to say it's going to be a little bit more complex, yeah. But
that's not necessarily always the worst thing. I'm I for one would like to read this more. I need to go and take a pass on this and Pep and leave opinions there before like saying I think one or the other. But I'm definitely not against making something like this, right? I mean, I think it makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. Just take your time, right? Like we don't have to come to a consensus on this call, like you said, just calling out for reviews, I guess, at this stage.
No, this is good though. And yeah, Raul, if you could kind of chime in too on the NPEP, I think if you have kind of a vision of how the FQDN selector worked, like would it make sense to live, you know, in another object, maybe even that is just referenced by ANP, like this external network set kind, could be something to think about.
I think Raul's not here.
Oh, he was here. Okay, he dropped off. No worries. Cool. Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day too, like as we keep adding features, like it is probably better to have more objects than one big object, one big complex object. Like I think the only problem is the complexity, like Nadia said, but if we have good tooling, that shouldn't be horrible, right? Like if the Cyclonus tooling to display what's going on is good, like we can end up, you know, shipping that as part of our release payload, right? So people can just use it.
Yeah, +1.
Super
Yeah,
interesting.
I think some. Oh, yeah.
Sorry, Yang, go ahead.
Sorry. I was just thinking, does that affect the point that we were just discussing like 5 minutes ago about the namespaces thing? Could, let's say, now that we have this external network set, right, and it's defined by labels, if
Oh, you broke up, Yang. We lost you, I think. Or I froze.
excluding the
Oh, you
external
came
network.
back.
No,
We
I
just
couldn't
lost
hear
you
him
for a
too.
minute.
Yeah.
Like we what was the thinking on like how do we include this in the ANP, because that definitely cannot go into the namespace and the pods fields, right? I'm assuming that is the case, but we also wanted to make sure that, you know, those don't overlap or unintentionally sort of like overleap with each other, right? Because we don't want the label selector to select both pod and the external network at the same time.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's a good.
I think when you're referencing other objects, you shouldn't really be using a label selector. You should just be referencing a name for another object. Like maybe you could have a, you know, like in the core ANP spec, you would have external network selector, and maybe one field would be label selector, the other would be name selector. I don't really know. Sorry, go ahead, Surya.
No, I was about to say that the way I defined this object is if you scroll up a little bit, it is a new type. Yeah, here it's a little more up, I guess. Sorry. Yeah, here we go. So I just called it external networks, and I'm explicitly saying that this is a thing that is outside your cluster. So I'm going to call it out that it's not your pod subnet, it's not your node subnet, it's not your service side or subnet, it's something outside. So that can never be namespace scoped. That will be well defined. So it's not something that can come under namespaces, but you're right that we should probably call that out, right? Like saying that this is global scoped and it is not a part of your namespace sphere.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
But yeah, Yang, do you have a preference on either or like you guys already have a global network policy kind of thing for Antria, right? How do you do it there? Do you directly just do a list of CIDRs on your API, or do you have another object outside?
Um, to be honest, I think it depends. Like we have both. I think we both support putting on CIDRs in the policy, and we also have something really similar to the external network set defined as a separate CRD, and now you can refer to it. I think the weird thing is I think in the Antrea design, for some reason, the external network set equivalence CRD in Antrea is actually a namespace scoped resource because of some of its use cases, right? So that could be a little bit confusing where when you select namespaces, it actually means that selecting all the pods or external networks in that namespace. Although in most cases, when a namespace has an external set of network, it is going to be only external set of networks in that namespace, but no pods. Sort of like resembles a I don't know, like cloud entity, something, right? Something residing in the cloud, for example, in AWS. Now, the external network set will, in the namespace, sort of like groups these entities together and telling you that everything in this namespace is from the cloud, basically. So really, we do actually run into the problem where we have to select pod and external networks in the same namespace, but obviously, you can imagine there's a lot of documentation and everything needed to tell people what the actual semantics of a namespace selector actually is, right? So that's why I'm raising the concern, actually. But in this case, if it's a cluster scoped resource, I think it shouldn't be any problem.
Yeah, that's a good point that you.
Mhm.
Sorry, I'll let you finish.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry.
That's actually a good point that you mentioned because we were looking at Calico's documentation and they do the exact opposite. So they also have two ways of selection, like a CIDR, which is a list of IPs on the API, and a global thing outside. And I think they had to create this global set outside because the other one is namespace scoped, especially with network policy. So they wanted a way to explicitly say something that is global scoped of kind. And then for Antrea, you're saying it's the reverse, which is you have entities that are not pods, right? So this is what we were discussing earlier, which is interesting. So yeah, it's something to consider in case there are real use cases for this. Like I just kept it simple for the first iteration to just explicitly say that it's global, right? Like we don't identify anything more than a pod in a namespace.
I think it's a good point. My first inclination is like we shouldn't be trying to overload terms that are already overloaded, right? Like from my first thinking about it, like namespaces shouldn't necessarily include all like an external network is not namespace because an external network is what we're calling it, right? It is something that is outside the cluster, right? It has nothing to do with cluster. Namespaces are explicitly part of the cluster, just like pods are part of the cluster, just like services are part of the cluster. External networks are not, right? It is and that's where I think we've kind of messed up in network policy some too, is like everything distills down to pods, but external network, CIDRs kind of don't, right? They never do.
Well, you actually never know, right? Because there could be a case where people are pulling AWS resources into the same cluster, and those are different resources in different regions, for example, right? Now they wanted, some networks in one namespace called, like, say, US West 1, and the other is US East, right? So, it depends on use cases. I'm not, saying that this is a bad use cases or good use case, but different users tend to do things differently. Like, so, and also like as implementers, sometimes we definitely have a preference over one approach over another, but you can't really stop user from doing what they think is best for their cluster. So
fair enough.
Yeah, but for me, I think I'm sort of like impartial to both approaches. We just also the other thing is obviously we wanted to define clearly what happens when the external network object is deleted, right?
like we said, everything should be explicit. So if there's nothing there, it means the rule doesn't really take any effect. We don't want any implicit things like now that the object is gone, something default is happening there, which is going to be really, really bad. So I just wanted to point that out. And
yeah, and it sounds like that's where we're gonna have to start thinking about conditions a little bit better, right? So
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah. So I know we're almost at time, right? But let's put all that in the reviews. Yeah, I will appreciate any reviews from all of you. So let's
Cool.
see how we can proceed there.
I'll take a pass. Yang will take a pass.
But I will definitely take a review of all of this next week.
Cool. You got really faint, Yang, but we can still hear you. Perfect. A lot of stuff to review. It's a good thing. I'm sure we'll get Dan too as well, because he's our new tech lead on this. So that's pretty awesome. Next thing was from Surya as well, doing a release of the standard channel now that we have experimental and standard channels, just so that we downstream consumers can have a version of the CRD without the experimental fields, which today are same labels and not same labels. That's on my list this week. I don't think we'll break anything, Surya, because technically no one should be using
Yeah.
same labels.
That
not
what I
same
meant
labels.
by that. Yeah. What I meant by breaking is I think it totally depends on the tenancy NPEP, and I know Nadia has put it on the PRs to review 123. What I meant is it depends on how the tenancy NPEP is implemented, right? So I don't know if the consensus is still to do a new object or if it is to keep it within folded with the main CRD. And the reason I ask this is because if you go back to your repo, Andrew, and then if you look at namespaced peer struct, so I think you had a GitHub thing open, right? The second
sorry,
tab
I have
that you
have a lot of
yeah, this one. So if you look at namespaced peer, yeah, if you scroll down, you have it there. So today we have namespace selector, and then we have same labels and not same labels. And for standard channel, we are removing same labels and not same labels, right? We're making it experimental, but the hope is that this eventually gets replaced by something that will refer to the tenancy CRD or whatever that will be. Like, I know we're not fixed there, but supposing we don't do this, right? We don't go the path of referring to a new CRD, which means that the same labels and not same labels will be deleted one day, but it's not replaced in tree. It's a new tenancy API CRD. Then we are only left with the namespace selector as the namespace peer. You might as well just put that as a selector. So it's making it like put that as a proper label selector on the main peer field, right?
Yeah,
like
100%.
So it's like, so that's the part that I worry that we might break a little bit, because this was pointed out to me by QE when they were testing. They were like, when you are referring to a subject, the subject is just the namespace selector. So it's a meta-v1.label selector. But when you're referring to a namespace as a peer, today we call it as namespaced peer, and then like namespaces, and then a namespace selector. So there's one level of hierarchy coming down. But then there is nothing else in it, because we don't today support same labels or not same labels. So if we don't support anything, and in the end, it's just the label selector in the main part of the namespaced peer, we might want to fold it back into the main peer, just like we have pods over. Like,
agreed. And that would be part of the deprecation of those fields if we so, if we deprecate without replacing. But again, like I'm not incredibly worried about the deprecation, especially of experimental.
But this one is what Yang was saying. This is a client-side breaking change, right? Because the way people do their YAMLs will change.
This is breaking, yeah. You will definitely have to write conversion webhooks and everything for that, yes.
Yeah, and I don't want to do that. So just one thing to keep in mind when we are doing the implementation for tenancy, to not do breaking, like not this level of breaking, right? Like, I mean, we're still tech preview and we have an alpha one, but we're going to start having users test it. So
this is not going to be the end of day, but it does. If it actually went that path, it does make the API a little bit cleaner or simpler, in my opinion. But obviously, there's going to be a lot of work to do. in terms
Yeah.
of rephrasing
But-
or the current YAML specs and stuff.
I mean, to be horribly brute about it, I know like Surya and Yang are thinking about this from a maintenance point of view, right? Like when you start shipping an API, any API, like even if it's tech preview, V1 Alpha 1, whatever, customers might want it, right? They might want to use the old version. They're going to be slow to get to some new version. But for an upstream group, right? For us purely in the upstream, like this is still V1 Alpha 1, right? Like we are making no guarantees that V1 Alpha 1 to V1 Alpha 2 is an upgradable CRD at all. Like we have no guarantees there. So
absolutely. I mean, +1 with you on that point. Like, I get it. I'm just like I'm a bit partial because I just wrote down a blog post that nicely shows how to use each field of the API, right? Like I said, this is how you do up here, and then suddenly we're like, oops, sorry, we changed. Huh? This blog post is irrelevant. Please don't use it. Like that's gonna be hard, right? Like, but I get it. That we are V1 Alpha 1 and we are subject to change. So.
well, that, and when we do new releases, we should say, it should be accompanied with an article or with a release note that says like, look, this is what happened, right? So I'm glad we're thinking about it. I really am. I'm hoping once we figure out egress and tenancy, those will be two of the biggest API changes that we will see as a group. Like those seem like pretty major refactors compared to, just the addition of new selectors and other little features. So hopefully by the time we get to beta, a lot of it will be figured out and we won't have any more breaking changes. So it's all good things to think about though.
Yeah, +1.
Cool. Okay, we are at time. Did we get to everything? Let me pull it back up. Oh my goodness, so many tabs. I think that was pretty much it. Call out for some more review on Nadia's tenancy PR. So literally everyone in this group, we have a lot of reviewing to do. I know we're all busy with KubeCon stuff, but the more we get done before, the more we'll have to talk about. Additionally, what I wanted to bring up was for everyone who has a PR open for an NPEP, during the maintainers track talk, we are going to have probably a slide for each NPEP that's in progress. I will be sharing the slides with y'all to kind of help / review. If you own an NPEP, like let's make sure we get stuff on the slide that you want people to think and talk about and hopefully bring feedback on. So look out for that. I'll be sharing it explicitly with the folks who own those. But yeah, that's all I have for today. We're at 1:02. Anyone want to leave some parting thoughts?
I wanted to quickly say a thing about this tenancy API. I actually removed that use case. If you remember, we discussed last time about having like the non-tenant, because I think the consensus was that it's not an important use case, at least at this point. So I removed that. I tried to reply to all the comments that are there. So I think it should be somewhere close to have all the user stories defined. So please take another look. Remember, the sooner we figure out how to move on with the tenancy, the more certain we'll be about our future changes. So yeah, trying to make sure it's merged sooner than later.
I'll take another pass here shortly. I actually did a little bit today and most things were looking good. Yang, if you could do so as well. I think this is kind of the next one up on the agenda to get in. So just need confirmation from the maintainers.
Yeah, will do.
Sweet. Awesome. Really productive meeting today, everyone. I like the momentum. Let's keep moving forward. Thanks so much for your time. Sorry we ran over, and we will see you in 2 weeks, I think, unless I got to check if that's already in KubeCon. I don't think it is, but I'll let everyone know in Slack. But thanks so much. Really appreciate it. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.